No, it's not working. I'll just have you tab through for now. So this one cracks me up, this little cartoon here. We passed it around over email a little bit. You got this Indiana Jones character. This really is how it feels sometimes, right? He's been exploring these ruins and these caves for who knows how long, and finally he comes upon the regulatory guidelines that help him understand. It sometimes feels like that, doesn't it? Right, we're trying to search the FDA's website. We're searching the web. There's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it seems to be carbon copies of what we've already found, or maybe it's less than useful. You get a lot of different messages. And so hopefully we can build some clarity today on some of the requirements. So I want to see tab. So as you're all probably aware by now, as we talk about produce safety, there is a one-day certificated course. It's the official recognized course, recognized by FDA. And the Produce Safety Alliance put it together. And we do offer this course. We've been doing a lot of courses with CDFA sponsoring them. So we've got a grant that we've gotten twice now from them, which is really exciting. And we've also worked with some other organizations as well. And this one-day course is something, and we'll talk more about it later as well, but it's something that is expected that somebody within any farming operation has taken. So now, most of you are involved in the growing operation here alive, right? Some sort, many of you are. So who's taken that course? Quite a number of you. Do any of you feel that you need to take the course and you haven't yet? Okay. So those of us that feel that they need to have already taken, which is good to know. So it is one day, and as it says on the slide there, we've been working with CDFA with FELS as well. FELS is part of that grant. They're part of the Farm Bureau. So then we've also had some courses that the Walnut Board has sponsored that we've offered, and that's been very exciting as well. That industry has really gotten ahead of things in getting a lot of their growers trained. And then the Almond Board has been doing a lot of training as well, and we've worked with them on a number of their courses too. So next slide. So you're going to see a lot of slides in here from the one-day training, all right? And so that's the intent is to kind of stay consistent with the one-day training, but again, we'll build around those as well and give you some supplemental information. So this first slide kind of covers the different rules that are part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. All right, and so as you can see, because this is from the produce safety training, the first one is the produce safety rule. It's in bold. And the other rules that are in there are preventive controls for human food as well as preventive controls for animal food, right? Which is really interesting. They've got basically a law for animal food that's equivalent to the very strict law they rolled out for human food. So I'll poll the audience here. So why do you think the FDA would be so concerned with what we're feeding to animals?
Because the kids can get into the animal.
Yeah, so your kids can get into the animal food, definitely, especially if it's pet food or if they're out in the farming operation, definitely. So we can, get an infection or.
There are a number of salmonella outbreaks that occur where it's related to pet food, and then there'll be secondary outbreaks in people that own the pets, because as you said, the kids play with the dog or the family cat or whatever, and they get the infection. So,
what are the reasons you guys think? Any others? Go ahead. Because we eat the animals. Correct. Yes. So the animals, there's an increased risk there if they've consumed anything that has pathogens in it. Those pathogens can colonize their systems, right? And so then we see them passing around these pathogens. It increases risk for us. And even those of us that are not eating the animals themselves, many of us consume animal products like milk or eggs, and it increases risk there as well. Yeah, so
absolutely.
So there are a number of other rules there related to transportation of food, related to import of food, related to even this summer as we roll out the final rule related to preventing intentional adulteration of food. So this is around security measures for the facility and things like that for processors. But one thing that I'm glad of is there is a foreign supplier verification rule, which the intent of that rule is to make sure that any imported foods into the U.S. are at the same level of equivalency in terms of safety and in terms of the growers or the processors systems that are selling those foods into the U.S. And of course, no regulation is perfect, right? That's going to be difficult to enforce, I'm sure. But the wheels are moving on that. And we're starting to see enforcement activity related to foreign suppliers even more than in the past now, I think.
Yes. Historically, FDA's approach to things was more reactionary. Something went wrong and they went out and investigated it. This is a very preventative system, and it's really, you've heard that old saying, it's a kind of a worn out saying, farm to fork, but you can really see that that is the approach they're taking: the growing, the food processing, the transportation, importation. So it's a much more comprehensive approach to food safety and preventative in mind.
Yeah. And next slide, please. Oh, thank you.
We'll move it.
Aha.
There you go.
Magical.
Cool.
All right. So these are the compliance dates for the produce safety rule. I'm sure most of you are well aware of them, largely based on revenue. Really, they are based on revenue. Right. So as you can see, the rule came out in January 2016. We had 2 years until the first compliance date passed for the largest operation. And so that puts us at January 2018. And the reason they haven't started enforcing the rule yet is because they gave an additional year. So they knew that it was very tough for many growers to get trained. Some of the requirements maybe took some additional time to comply with. And so this month, right, today, this January, what is it, the 26th, something like that, right. The all other businesses category and the small businesses category, from 250,000 in revenue per year and up, are going to be fair game for enforcement. Right,
and the state of California has been training. CDFA is going to be responsible for doing a lot of the on-farm assessments, and they've been in a training mode this last year because the regulators had to learn about the regulation.
Yes.
Once it was all finalized and back and forth through the Federal Register, then they have to figure out what they're going to do. And so they've been doing on-farm assessments, which you might touch on later, kind of working with growers to kind of figure out almost collectively, well, what is the intent of that regulation? So they're finally ready to start doing some on-farm assessments. And hopefully, they've said that they want to be in more of a educate before we regulate mode, because they know this is a new regulation, things are very different. So we're anticipating that hopefully they'll be more in that educate mode rather than regulate, but we will see, I suppose.
Yeah, and we will talk about those on-farm readiness reviews a little bit later too, as well as some of the things that they are pointing out that they've found on those. So now it's not tabbing anymore. There's a gremlin. There we go. All right. So this is a further breakdown of the compliance dates. All right. And so the reason that I included this is because it also has the water-related compliance dates. You can see there are separate dates also for sprouts. Sprouts are probably the riskiest produce item. And then some others related to the qualified exemption and some other things. But the third column, the one that's in blue in the header, is indicating the modified compliance dates for water compliance. All right. And so what that tells us is when the rule first came out, there were an extra 2 years to comply with the water requirements, but they proposed 2 more years. So we actually have an extra 4 years for water compliance under this rule now. Now, I still haven't heard that that's been finalized, Mike. I don't know if you've heard any different, or Tom, but we expect that proposed change to be finalized at some point by FDA.
We're waiting.
We're still waiting. Yeah. So,
nothing much coming out of FDA.
Yeah.
Right now, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. As he said, I don't know if you could hear him, but there has not been much coming out of FDA. They're very close to the chest with all of these changes to the rules, it seems.
Right, right.
So, did you have a question back there? No? Okay. So this slide indicates just from the data set of 1996 to 2014, the various outbreaks that are likely attributable back to the growing operation, to the produce itself coming in contaminated. And the point of this slide, at least to me, is not to point any fingers at anyone, but to help people understand that really nobody is exempt, right? And issues can arise for anybody. You can see that in addition to things like leafy greens or some of the fresh produce items that we would consider maybe more risky, we've even got some related to almonds and some other things there that you might think of as less risky or lower risk. And so every grower should be taking action to help reduce risk in their operation. Interesting to me there, the sprouts are 25% of the total number, even though they're definitely not 25% of what we consume out of all those things. So, and another thing I always point out in these trainings is leafy greens has a 25% section of that. And there's a numbers game here. So when we consume an awful lot of something, yes, we see more things come out in the market. And people are eating salads all over the place every day.
Lettuce on their hamburgers, etc.
Exactly, on hamburgers. So not just salads, right? And so leafy greens are everywhere. And so I always tell people I continue to eat a lot of leafy greens. It's not a concern to me, and that industry has done a lot. In fact, Mike is here. He'll talk some more later about some of what they've done. I also, though, one more thing on this slide, I think it would be really interesting to see what's happened since 2014 and get the updated data through 18. Because there have been a lot of interesting things that have changed recently. Seen cyclospora outbreaks, which hasn't happened for a long time, and that's been one interesting thing. So, so the organisms that we really concern ourselves with fall into three categories for produce or any food, really, is bacteria, viruses, and parasites. All right, so bacteria far and away are the greatest concern, and when we think of E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, I mean, these are the big ones, right? These are the bacteria. And the thing that's unique about them is that they can grow outside of a host. So if you look at viruses and parasites, they need to be inside a living organism in order to multiply. Bacteria, on the other hand, do not. So we'll see them getting on produce and surviving and multiplying and increasing in number, and even increasing in number in soil, or at least surviving.
For example, Salmonella can grow on almond hulls. It can grow in our own digestive tract if we become infected. It can grow in animals. So these organisms are very diverse, and they have a lot of options open to them. So they're real survivors.
And uniquely, we found internally with some of our research that they seem to be afraid of Tom. They go running. And so if you want to keep your facility clean, you can just have him hang out there.
That's right.
A microbiologist.
I'll chase him away.
Chase him away. So. So bacteria are out in the environment, yes. They're in the soil, they're in the animals, and there's no way to completely keep them out of the produce, right? We know this. And so I think compliance with the produce safety rule is not intended to tell growers that, hey, your stuff's got to be totally sterile when it comes into the processor. Really what we're trying to tell growers, I think, with this regulation and with this training is, let's do everything we can to minimize risk. Let's do everything we can to deal with those key factors that are the highest risk. And that seems to track back to things like contaminated water, handling raw manure, things like that. And how do we do those things? And how do we minimize risk in those things? Really, that's what we're trying to tell growers. So viruses and parasites both uniquely are not as susceptible to a lot of the sanitizers that we use that will kill bacteria. Okay, so that's one factor we need to keep in mind with viruses and parasites. They can be harder to kill or remove even than bacteria. All right, so they're both very stable in the environment, and it may only take one or a few particles to make somebody sick. And so, and viruses, you think about, I think I saw another in the news recently, these cruise ships where a bunch of people got sick, and that's typically the norovirus.
Right, and if you think about it, a virus is just kind of sitting there. It's just waiting for that host to come along so that it can take over the host cells and start to grow. So it's kind of metabolically inactive. It's just waiting like a little hand grenade or a landmine or something, you know. So it's, if something isn't metabolically active, it's a lot harder to kill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the thing with viruses too is they're pretty specific when it comes to host, right? And so a virus that humans are going to be susceptible to typically is going to come from another human, right? That's why we have such strong requirements around not working when you're sick and things like this. There are a few cases where there's crossover. So we got swine flu, bird flu, right? Where things, you know, cross species. They're zoonotic and they cross species from animals to humans, but that's rare. So really controlling these is largely back to humans and hygiene controls. So parasites, Tom, you always cover this one really well when we do the training. You talk about a show that you like to watch. I don't know if you
yeah, there's a television show. I don't know if any of you have seen it, called Monsters Inside Me, and it's this fascinating show. It's creepy, but you know, people will typically go on vacation. They'll go to some wonderful exotic location. Maybe they swim or they eat food or drink water, and then they come back a few months later and they have something, you know, crawling under their skin, or their eyes are bloodshot or something. And it's typically a parasite. It's often either a parasitic worm of some sort, or it's a single-celled parasite. These are basically animals. And it's the same sort of thing. They often have cysts that are very inert, very difficult to kill. You know, they're just waiting for a host to come along. They're a little more diverse typically than viruses. Often there will be animals that can transmit this as well. I talk a lot when I do the produce safety training about Cryptosporidium, and there was an incident in which the city of Milwaukee actually had to shut down their water system because there was an issue with raccoons getting into the water supply and, you know, defecating in the water. People consumed the water, they got sick with it. So they actually had to go in and do this kind of high intensity chlorination carpet bombing of the water system, of course, after they chased out the raccoons and fixed the leaks. So it can be a really challenging thing sometimes to figure out as well, because it can be some months, you know, after someone may have been exposed that they actually get ill.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you, Tom.
yeah.
So health impacts by pathogen type. Again, bacteria far and away are the biggest concern. Just numerically looking at it, they are the highest risk in terms of, you know, past outbreak data. And it makes sense, right? Because they're just so diverse and so ubiquitous. They're spread throughout the environment. So again, it comes back to what strategies can we use to control these little guys, right? When it comes to things like good sanitation, selecting our water sources carefully, treating water if need be. Of course, there's always a cost associated with doing that, but sometimes that may be your only option. And again, either using treated animal products and avoiding raw ones, or if you use raw ones, raw manure and other animal products, then being selective about how you do it. And of course, human hygiene and things like that. So some clear challenges with produce, right? A lot of it's eaten raw, isn't it? Right? It's not necessarily heat treated. We may have wash steps, but they're not always completely effective in reducing an entire population of pathogens, especially if there's a high number. And one of the things that's important to understand is with pathogens of any of the three categories, that it really is, again, a numbers game, just like I said earlier. What the initial population is, the level of contamination is in the produce to begin with, will directly affect the likelihood later of somebody getting sick, because number one, our immune systems can often fight off small numbers. Number two, if they're small numbers to begin with, they're easier to remove. When we start to get into high numbers, we've got a colonization going on where they start to get into the pores. Of course, the example of the cantaloupe, right, with the rough skin, and the bacteria get in there. They can also get into the stomata of leaves and other areas where it's hard to reach those areas with sanitizer and kill them. And there's not really a heat treatment involved in a lot of this produce, right? Unless we all want to be eating, you know, canned produce the rest of our lives, which is not going to happen, right? Fresh produce is something that's a preference for all of us, and so, or many of us at least. And so just one other thing on this, when we talk about populations too, is that there's a kind of a broad misunderstanding that, okay, this product is pasteurized, so I don't have to worry about bacteria because it's going to be pasteurized later. So the thing is, pasteurization, there's a standard we use called the 5 log. Okay, a 5 log reduction, and it's basically scales of 10. So every time you knock off 1 log in the population of bacteria, you're knocking off a 0. So if we have 1,000 bacteria and we have a 1 log reduction, now we have 100 there. That makes sense? So if we're taking milk, right, if we're taking almonds, whatever else it is, and we're running it through a pasteurization with a standard of a 5 log or a 6 log reduction, and we have fecal matter in there, guess what? Feces has, what, 11 log in it, 12 log of bacteria sometimes. It has a lot of bacteria in it. So again, it comes back to what is the initial population as to what the risk is later.
The other thing I might point out on that one too is about the contamination being sporadic.
Yes.
You might think, well, maybe I can just test everything I produce and I should be safe, right? The challenge with that is you might not find that one needle in a haystack. And so that's part of where all these food safety principles came from. John will probably talk about this later. When we talked about sending people to the moon, NASA looked at end product testing as a way to look for food safety concerns, and they realized that that wouldn't be good enough, that they had to try and prevent the contamination in the first place, because they would not be able to reliably ensure that the food the astronauts were eating would be safe.
Yeah.
You can't really test your way out of this. You need to be preventative as well.
Mm-hmm. I just want to throw out a reminder too to our live audience that you folks are part of this, and so if you have any questions, feel free to to type them into the system there. And those of you here in the room, of course, I mean, we want this to be interactive, right? We want to help educate you, and it's a lot more fun when we talk, right? We don't want to just preach at you and throw PowerPoint slides up in front of you. Thank you. First question.
How does freezing?
Oh yeah, great question.
Excellent
do you want to
question.
speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, freezing can certainly reduce the numbers of some organisms, but many of them will survive very well in freezing. So they won't die at all. In fact, you just preserve them. In fact, that's how we preserve bacterial strains or microbial strains, is we actually cryogenically freeze them.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, definitely. Now, is that different with parasites? Right? So, because
yeah,
I know
some parasites, I know, like sushi and some of the raw, raw meats and things, they will do that. The larger multicellular organisms are more likely to die.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're dealing with bacterial cells or, single cell spores or something of this sort, it's not a reliable way to take care of them.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Good question.
Yeah.
So this slide here, it's easy to pass this by when we do the produce safety training, but I think this slide is key because it kind of shows you the roadmap for the rest of the training, which is, we've got our produce in the middle here, and we've got all the different ways that it can become contaminated, right? So this directs really the content of the regulation itself, as well as the content of the one-day training. And so, we talk about controls with humans, with soil, with water, with animal controls, with equipment and buildings. And all of those are key factors, right, in terms of keeping our products safe. So digging into each of those different types just briefly, let's talk a little bit about people here. Of course, there's a lot of ways that food can become contaminated by people, whether it's dirty hands, whether it's using the restroom and not washing up afterward or not washing up adequately. I, for one, I don't know about you folks in the room, but I have noticed a lot of folks that either don't wash or don't wash well after when I'm at a restaurant or some other situation like that. Anybody see that before? And even in the food processing environment, sometimes maybe they skip on the soap or they just go really quickly. I've even been out to a hauler before where I saw someone come out of the porta potty and didn't wash their hands and went back to handling nuts.
Yeah, and hopefully they're not wearing the chef's costume, at the restaurant. So
yeah. And
that can
happen.
happen.
Question, it looks like.
Yeah, so one of our attendees wants to know, do growers in the grain industry, wheat, rice, fall under the produce safety rule?
So there are some carve-outs. That's a great question.
It's an excellent question.
Do growers in the grain industry fall under the produce safety rule? And there are some carve-outs in there related to those types of commodities. And so that's something that we could maybe dig into more offline with you. But some of those commodities do have an exemption, largely because it kind of goes back to the intended use of the product, right? And you're not going to grab a bag of wheat kernels from the store typically and eat them raw, right? I mean, so they get ground up into flour, or maybe we throw them into some baked good, but they're typically for later processing. But something we're going to talk about in this afternoon session related to preventive controls is that FDA is looking at not only the intended use of products, but reasonably foreseeable unintended use. Because guess what? A lot of people are eating things in different ways than we ever intended them to.
Raw cookie dough.
Yeah, that's a big one, right?
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, there was an incident a few years back where there was an E. coli illness outbreak associated with raw cookie dough. And in the investigation, the main risk elements seem to point to the flour being a source of that. And so there have been some studies showing that flour grains can have a very low level of contamination with these pathogens. So you may be exempt from the rules, but that doesn't mean you don't want to think about these food safety principles.
Yeah, that's the other point, right? Is even those that have an exemption, here in this room, right? Or those listening live, that you need to keep in mind that just because you have an exemption from the rule doesn't mean you shouldn't be taking preventive steps and asking yourself, what could I be doing different? What could I be doing better here? Even if I don't follow the rule to the letter in every section, there are probably things that you can be doing to help reduce risk. And really, it comes down to protecting yourself, right? It's not just about trying to prevent somebody from finding that bacteria in your product, but preventing it from being in there and causing you to have a recall and impacting your livelihood as well. So this is my kind of little summary of the requirements in the people section. And really there's a lot more there. This is kind of a high level summary. There's a lot built into it. So we're required to establish practices and to train everyone on those practices. All right, and that goes back to whether we're handling the produce, whether we're harvesting the produce, whether we're handling soil amendments, right? And getting training around that, making sure people understand, hey, there's an elevated risk here because you're handling an animal product or even a chemical soil amendment still bears a certain level of risk that they've got to be aware of. Right, and on the slide previously here, and I'll just back up for a moment, you see clothing there at the top in the middle. Something that people don't necessarily always think about is, okay, so my employees are coming into work today, right? They're going to be harvesting, they're going to be handling produce, or they're going to be walking through the fields. What were they doing at home before they came in? Do they have chickens? Do they have goats? Do they have cows? Are they out there feeding those animals, dealing with them out in their stalls? And did they wear the same shoes, the same clothing to work, right? That's not something you can monitor directly. You just can't, right? So have those conversations with your employees. Make sure they understand, look, if you got animals at home, please use different shoes. Dedicate some shoes that you don't wear when you're dealing with animals because it could put the safety of our products in jeopardy. So another requirement around people is communication with visitors and making sure that your employees understand what are our rules around visitors and what do I do if I see somebody wandering around out there that could put our products at risk? So it looks like we have a question from
Another online question.
Yes, so this question is from a farm manager at a nonprofit educational farm. They don't sell produce, they only use it here with students. Are they subject to the same requirements even though they don't sell produce?
That's a tricky one, right? Because
It is a tricky one. There are carve-outs for very small operations, under 25,000, I believe, in annual sales. There's also modified requirements for folks that do like produce sales at farmers markets and things of that nature.
Yeah, definitely. So there is that. And the other thing is the aspect of if it's not for sale, right? But we still see some regulation of things that are given away that are not for sale anyway. Typically under local health departments, they will regulate things like not-for-profits. We've started to see, in fact, in the past 2 years or so, some recalls on products that were given away from food banks.
Right.
Because they found that it may be under processed or wasn't handled appropriately or refrigerated or it's beyond its expiration date and it may not be safe.
I think the question that a regulator might ask them is what happens to this food? What do you do with it? So they would probably at least want to keep records of where it goes and how it's distributed. And train the students on good practices.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, hopefully those students would wind up working in agriculture or in this industry, and it would be nice to introduce them to those concepts early.
Yeah, definitely.
They might get more specific answers on the technical assistance, the TAN network. You might want to talk about that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point too. So FDA has a technical assistance network on their website. So what this is there's a bunch of folks involved. They have a huge database, a knowledge database built around questions like this. And so you go into their website under fda.gov, fda.gov/FSMA, FSMA. And you can go in there and you can find out any information that you need about any of the rules from that site. And you can also go in there and ask a question. And of course, if you're looking for this technical assistance network and you can't locate it, please reach out to us and we'll help you find it. But what you do is you go in there and you fill out a short series of questions about what you're looking for, and then you type in your actual question. Provide as much information as you can. Give them details so that they can better answer your question. And then they will respond to you and give you their best answer as best they can. And go from there. And any answers they will say is based on their current thinking. So nothing is legally binding there. but they will give you some great answers. And I've reached out to them a number of times now through their TAN and gotten some great answers to questions, either because I was curious, or most of them have been on behalf of a customer who didn't want to do it themselves because they didn't want to get on FDA's radar for whatever reason. So they asked me to pose the question on their behalf. It's fda.gov/FSMA/FSMA. And I think you have to have the 3 W's in front of FDA or it won't work properly.
Or they could probably Google FDA Technical Assistance Network
you
or
could
something.
do that
and
too.
boom,
I'm sure it would come
it goes
up.
right
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. So visitor communication, restrooms, as I said, for visitors and employees both, and hand washing. You have to provide adequate hand washing utilities. So
Right.
that gets back to providing water. It doesn't say warm, right? We expect warm water, don't we, for restaurants, for food processors. On the farm, I think they understand that that's not realistic. So we've got water, soap, and adequate hand drying. And they leave that kind of open-ended when they say adequate. So typically we're looking for single-use paper towels or something like that. We're definitely not looking for the old gas station restroom rollers. If any of you remember those, I don't think they have those in too many places anymore. That cloth roller, I guess they would just rewash. I always wondered if it was just a loop and it just dries on the inside. And then
I've seen them over in Europe, though, still to this
Have
day.
you?
They
Interesting.
roll it out.
So yeah, and Mike, I don't know if you have any comments on hand washing best practices in terms of drying your hands.
Well, I get the nail on single-use paper towels. It really works, and the cold water can be a challenge, particularly out early in the morning. It's something you got to really motivate to get in there and get it done. I'm not going to wash for 20 seconds, but get in there and get it done. Would just make a quick comment though on, because it kind of stands out with these porta potties, field sanitary units. You got to have enough units so that people get in and out. So there's sufficient time on break so they can wash their hands. There's been some real improvements in how those units are built and designed so that people can get in and out.
Yeah, great, thank you. So yeah, single-use towels, and for those of you that couldn't hear on our web-based, and the hand washing, the 20 seconds can be a challenge, especially when it's cold, early mornings, things like that. So try to reiterate, and then making sure you have adequate restrooms that are accessible. And some of them, they've got different designs out now, he mentioned, and some of them are better than others. And so definitely something to explore and look into. So worker qualification, very important. Training, making sure employees are qualified for their position and able to fulfill their duties, which can be a challenge. And it seems to be more and more these days, right? I don't know if any of you have found that, but it seems to be a big challenge trying to get people. And if you do get people, sometimes they don't stay. So I know that's a challenge. Soil amendments, big risk here in terms of wind spread, in terms of water runoff from these piles of soil amendments. And as we apply them, there's risk inherent to them. So you might think, well, I'm applying a chemical soil amendment. It's not an animal base, so there's no risk. Not really true, because that's definitely something you don't want to be consuming. So if it gets directly on the edible portion of the crop, that's definitely a no-no. As well, I know Tom has mentioned a number of cases where they've found pathogens in these synthetic soil amendments, right?
It has happened.
Yeah.
It has happened. It's kind of a bizarre, rare occurrence, but it does occur.
Yeah.
So you have to think about that. You also have to think about, in this area, there's so many dairies, that lagoon water, so liquid wastes can flow over. If someone is using that for irrigating, it might spill into an area that's unintended. So requirements we're looking at with soil amendments, because of the risk posed by them, is if you have treated soil amendments that you are purchasing, making sure there's a controlled process for that you're buying from a reputable source that's doing the right thing. And they've got some temperature and time requirements built into that we can talk more about offline. That's in our one-day class as well. And if you're treating soil amendments on your own, on your property, you've got to make sure that's a controlled process that you're applying. And so you've got to meet those requirements yourself. Storage and handling practice for any raw animal products so that you minimize risk. And we tend to focus verbally when we talk about it on raw manure, but really any raw animal products, bone meal, blood meal, anything like this that's
that's kind of built into soil amendments is going to fall into this category. And then maintaining records. So what did you purchase? Who'd you buy it from? Do you have any proof that it was treated properly if you're buying a treated product, right? Do they tell you about what their process is? You know, and then records of what you applied where and when, right? So I guess that goes back to an important point with the produce safety rule is they don't expect a huge, robust written food safety plan. What they do expect is some records to be kept that may be new records for some of you. Yeah, so you may not be keeping records currently of what you apply and when in adequate detail, right? And so having those records gets important. And if you think about it, if you just put yourself in the mindset of things that we already have to do in California related to pesticides, you'll be on the right track in terms of some of these other practices, in terms of the records we have to keep and things like that. Yes?
We got an online question. Do hand washing stations out in the field need to be covered?
Do hand washing stations in the field need to be covered? I don't think so. No, you'll see, and Mike's saying no as well from LGMA, right? So, you know, you see these containers of water with a little spigot, and, you know, you either make sure they're far enough away from the produce or you have a bucket, right, to catch the water.
Right.
So that whatever's on your hands is not getting into the produce. But I don't think it's practical to have a covered station. If anything, they might be attached to that trailer, right, that they drive through the fields with
Usually
the
on the
harvest crew.
sides. Yeah.
Yeah, you see them on the trailers actually.
Right.
And then part two to that question, is air drying okay, but or it doesn't have to be single-use towels? I believe that's okay.
Is there, you just dry, you know, you really need to see.
You know, and here's why. If I don't have any towels and those blower things usually don't work, what do I do?
Yep.
Because I don't want stuff sticking to my wet hands. And you've just defeated the purpose of washing your hands. So for those of you that, I don't know if you saw that online, but I was like wiping my hands on my pants. So
The other thing that I always point out with hand washing is that, you know, we've got 4 or 5 steps, whatever it is that you train, 6 steps, right? But the 4 steps that we always talk about, every one of them helps remove stuff, bacteria, soil, whatever. So the initial rinsing, right? That helps remove stuff, right? The scrubbing with soap, that helps remove stuff. The follow-up rinsing. And then even the paper towel drying, there is proof through research that's been done that removes further stuff. Right? So skipping on that is short changing the process a little bit, I think. All right, so we do want to keep things moving along. I know I have a lot more slides that I built in. So animals definitely pose a risk. Largely, it comes back to what they leave behind, right? The biggest risk factor with animals is the
John, are you going to say it or am I?
Contamination.
What they always tell us to say.
Don't pick poop.
That's it. That's the buzzword.
And I actually built it into the next slide, so thank you. Or no, it's later. Anyway. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, that's an important point, right? That they shared that phrase with us in our training as trainers. Tell people to share with their teams the phrase "don't pick poop," right? So anything that looks like it may be contaminated by animals, that shouldn't be sold for human food. All right, we don't want to say, "Oh well, we'll just wash it off; it's fine," right? Because again, we go back to how many log, 11 log, 12 log that's there. How do you remove that effectively? You really can't, right? So monitor as appropriate for animal activity during the growing season. This will vary. Leafy greens, other row crop, tomatoes, strawberries, things like that. There's going to be a lot more robust expectations there. Tree fruit, nuts, you know, grapes for raisins, things like that. Maybe a little bit reduced expectation of monitoring during the growing season there in terms of contamination. But regardless, immediately prior to planting for an annual crop, you should be assessing to make sure that it's not going to get contaminated right from the get-go when you plant it. And then immediately prior to harvest, no matter what you're harvesting, there should be some assessment, right? Whether it's hand-picked or whether there's a shaker driving through and shaking those nuts off the tree. Somebody should be going out scouting ahead or the person who's doing the sweeping, somebody like that should be looking for evidence of anything that's going to come in with those products because that's a huge risk. And I've had a number of growers share with me that the coyotes tend to leave things behind on the windrows for whatever reason they like to do that. So Additionally, controlling
Coyotes.
domesticated animals based on risk, right? If they're going to be going out in the fields, we want to keep them from doing that, especially as it gets closer to harvest, or for those crops that are row crop. We want to just try to prevent that completely if we can. If we have visitors, tell them to keep their animals in their car or at home, right? Don't let them wander around. And then training, corrective actions, and records around all of these controls. All right, so water. This is one of the most controversial parts, probably the most controversial part of the regulation, which is the whole requirement around testing your water, establishing a long-term microbial water quality profile. And we do that testing here in the lab. We can answer a lot of your questions around that. In fact, we're going to have a session here in a little bit on some practical tips on doing that sampling, so that if you do want to bring us a sample, you know, you can do that. And we've got some documentation we can send away with our customers as well, things like that. So again, I need to keep things moving along in terms of time, but just briefly defining what is covered water, or what is agricultural water, because that's really what you want to look at in the regulation. Look at the definition of agricultural water. That's what you need to do testing on, right? You can do testing on all your water, but especially anything that is agricultural water. So what defines that? What do I need to test? First of all, those areas that I'm growing covered produce. If it falls under the regulation, then it may be fair game. Then the next question is the activity I'm using the water for covered? Is it intended to, or is it potentially likely to come in contact with the harvested portion of the crop? Right? So those growers of tree crop that have impact sprinklers, right? And they say, well, you know, I'm not hitting the actual harvestable portion. And then I drive by their orchard and the impact sprinklers are hitting the trees. It's, you know, it's covered. It's covered, right? So irrigation of crops at ground level, certain types of sprinklers, or even crop sprays. And additionally, I would throw out there too, if you're cleaning your harvest equipment with water, technically I would say that's probably covered as well. Right? So just be strategic with your sources of water is the best advice I can give you. If you have 5 wells and you have a surface water source, try to avoid using the surface water for any covered activities. If you're able to use the well water and maybe minimize down to 1 or 2 or 3 water sources for those covered activities, it helps reduce your risk, and it'll reduce the amount of testing you have to do.
Yeah, but if you're doing, say, furrow irrigation of citrus, you're probably fine with that furrow irrigation water.
Yes.
It's not contacting the citrus. So you might want to use, for example, your well water for your foliar sprays. That way you only have to test that part of it.
Definitely. So requirements around water. In general, the overarching requirement, whether it's growing or whether it's packing activities at the packing house, is the water needs to be safe and of adequate sanitary quality. In the field, this means we have to be below certain threshold numbers that FDA has given us. They've given us specific numbers. When it comes to post-harvest, so the equipment we're using to harvest, when we're putting produce into flumes, when we're sending produce nuts to the huller, produce to the dehydrator, any water used in those activities after harvest needs to be no detectable generic E. coli in that water. So it's basically, we're looking at something with respect to drinking water quality, more or less, right, in terms of safety, right? Because out in the field, there's a potential for things to die off a little bit. We don't have that luxury after harvest. It's too close to the consumer. Bless you. Inspect your distribution systems, right? At least annually or as applicable. So looking at the pipelines, looking at, have animals chewed through this? Is it going to spray up in the tree even though I didn't expect it to? Is there animal activity because they're thirsty? Right? What's going on out there that I need to be aware of? So inspecting those systems to make sure that water doesn't become contaminated or a source of contamination. Right? Then we've got the testing, developing that water quality profile. An appropriate response to unusual events like, oops, we left the pump on too long and now the fields are flooded and it's touching the produce. Or like we had up north this past year was all the flooding, right? And did that impact any crops? Because if there is a flood like that, a flooding event, and it touches produce, FDA now considers it adulterated because you really have no control over the quality of that water, right? You've got vehicles, you've got porta potties, you've got animals and everything that could get caught up in that flow of that water.
John?
Yes.
I want to mention real quick, the LGMA actually has a series of procedures you do when you have flooded product, and it sort of mirrors the FDA, but it's pretty good stuff because there's a time lapse, you can test your way out or just let it dry out, and there's some buffers as far as how far that water is. So, there's some things you need to consider when you get flooded water.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So it sounds like LGMA has built some more structure around assessing when a flood occurs and what the risk is. And there are some ways to work around and try to minimize risk on it for some things.
Yeah, LGMA is a great reference because their standards were some of the earliest established for this sort of thing. And they were often used as a guiding document in the creation of the produce safety rule.
Yeah. Yeah. So where can they find that information or resources? Is it on the LGMA website or?
Yeah, it's in we call it our metrics. It's just a whole flooding section. Pretty straightforward.
So in the LGMA metrics, there's a whole flooding section. So, so with equipment, buildings, surfaces, there's definitely a lot of contamination that can occur there. This gets back to good sanitation, making sure that things are clean, good design of equipment. Also keeping packaging materials, bins, containers clean, making sure they're not a source of contamination. The suitability of vehicles to make sure they're not going to be a source of contamination as well. Are they clean? Are they in good condition? And pest management. So we've got this process of assessing risk, then implementing a practice to minimize that risk, monitoring that practice to make sure it's implemented properly, keeping an eye on things. And when something occurs that could be a problem, right, we apply a corrective action, and then finally we keep records of what we've done. So this is the structure we talk about a little bit more at length within the produce safety rule. So we assess risk for your farm, for your practices, for what you do. Whether that's typical animal activity that you see every year, whether that's worker hygiene, water sources, all the things we've already talked about, we assess those within our own operation and look for risk. And so this is a great slide from the official training that I really like, which shows different risk factors in a theoretical growing operation. I don't think anybody would ever build their farm at the base of a dam that was built backwards, right? So I think impending
it's Oroville,
flood
it's
there,
bulging.
it's bulging
yeah.
dam. But you can see the potential for wildlife there, the potential for a cattle up above, a feedlot, maybe some drainage down onto the property. We've got a place where there's some electric lines that animals, birds tend to hang out, right? So all these things are things that we should be looking for. And if we see animal evidence in an area, we got to consider that. Say, is that a risk for my products, right? Or water sources or any potential contamination that we can spot. So really this goes back to implementing good agricultural practices, and the FSMA training is going to give you some general guidelines and rules, but really we're looking for what good agricultural practices apply best to your operation to minimize risk. And that depends on whether you're growing cherries, leafy greens, tree nuts, raisins. It's all going to be variable with respect to what you're growing, what you're doing. So monitoring, definitely something we need to keep an eye on things. We need to keep good records, what's going on, all of that. So definitely looking for good monitoring and record keeping of all those activities. Corrective actions. And I always say, I hope that there was nobody in that porta potty there when it fell over. That'd be an unpleasant experience, to say the least. But you can establish some corrective actions in advance to plan for things that can occur. And then when they do occur, make sure that you fix whatever problem occurred, and both short-term fix for the symptoms and long-term fix for preventing it from occurring again. And if you want to dig deeper into the corrective action piece, we have a root cause analysis and corrective actions webinar available on our website that you can sign up for and take as well. That's a course that I think will help fill in some of those gaps. If you want to see what's expected in terms of food safety programs with corrective actions and root cause. So record keeping, as we said, definitely a key part of this whole regulation. When FDA visits, they're going to be asking for records, training records, inspection, sanitation records, things like this. Keep those records for at least 2 years. I recommend maybe a little bit more than that because products that you have grown, they take a while before they get processed, packaged, and out to the consumer. But at least 2 years is kind of the minimum threshold there. There are a lot of templates out there. There's some that come with the training, as you see in that screenshot, but also LGMA. I know citrus industry, avocado industry, cherry industry all have GAP programs, and so there are templates out there. If you're a grower and this is kind of new to you, if you know anybody in the industry that has GAP, give them a call, shoot them an email, say, hey, what are you doing about this? Do you have any templates? Do you know anything that I can go download to help get me started that I can modify for myself? So basics of record keeping, they can be handwritten, but please don't do it in pencil. They can also be electronic, but they need to be readily retrievable, right? If FDA gives you a call, or if they stop by, or if the state comes on their behalf, they're looking for within 24 hours, right? So if they drop by and ask you for something from a year and a half ago, will you be able to pull it up and give it to them within 24 hours? That's kind of the rule of thumb. All right, so do use technology to your advantage where you can, and build record keeping into your routines. Right? So people get used to it and just do it without thinking. Farm food safety plan is something that we talk about in the training. It's not a requirement, but it's a strong recommendation that you build some sort of plan in place. I always suggest start simple first, right? You don't need to have anything really, really complex. Start simple and you can build on it going forward from there. All right, so in summary for this section, again, building a food safety plan, building a program, building records around it is going to support food safety for your farm. It's going to help cover you and prevent any interruptions to your business, any impacts to you in terms of long-term health of you and your financial concerns. And so your commitment as management is key here. Right, we always see that food safety programs are only successful when they're built from the top down, right? So they take cues from you, and if you're emphasizing the importance of these things, you're much more likely to see a successful program. And making sure that providing adequate training and resources is a huge part of that. If people aren't trained, they don't know. If they don't have the resources they need, then how are they going to do it? Right? They're going to try and improvise, but that's always inferior to having what they need. And being able to do it. So on-farm readiness reviews, we are short on time here, so I will just say things they've been pointing out in on-farm readiness reviews that they've done. Things like, why is the outhouse out there in the field with the crops? Do you have records of training? Do you have training programs? What does it look like? What sort of proof do you have around, say, training on hand washing, general food safety? I know Mike had mentioned earlier that they have a little app that you can use. It's got like a 5-minute video on hand washing. It's a great way to have your teams get trained on a tablet, on a phone.
It's on our website. You can download it.
That's great.
It's on YouTube. And it qualifies as that training before they start their work study test. And it's English and Spanish. It's a good tool.
Repeat.
The live audience is just having a hard time hearing our in-person audience.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So Mike is just saying that, reiterating what I said, that they've got a little 5-minute video that you can watch on their website or on YouTube. And it qualifies as training for employees on hand washing properly. And you just keep a record then that you've had them go through that training with you.
And it's in English and Spanish too. So that's great.
Yeah, which is great. It's an app.
It's an app.
That's outstanding.
Oh, fantastic.
That's outstanding.
Oh, I'll find out.
See,
Yeah.
you're going to test him now, aren't you? Put him on the no,
Right.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, so on-farm readiness reviews, to my understanding, are now only available for the smallest operations, right? Because if the state or FDA
Correct.
comes and visit you now, you're under the regulation if you're medium or large. Once that date passes, which is just a few days here, I guess.
$500,000 too is not a whole lot in California agriculture.
Yeah, it's really
You
not
know.
a whole lot. So
For small farms in New Hampshire or something, it might be, but here, I mean, a very large percentage of our farms will qualify right away.
yeah. So we do have our conference coming up in April, Safe Food California. And we have a session on on-farm readiness reviews. We have a few sessions on some other topics related to growing. And so any of you that are interested in coming, we encourage you to look at the website, check out the agenda. It's safefoodcalifornia.com. All right. And so check that out. You can easily go into the agenda and click on the little thing that says grower track, and it'll show you the sessions that are applicable to you as a grower. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us. So.
And there's also a $100 discount before the 25th.
Yes, early bird discount, $100. That's not insignificant by any means. So,
For those of you folks online, our business development manager, Annette McGee, just said that there is a discount available if you register for the early bird, and that's January 25th.
great.
So get in there, get registered now.
Thank you.
Come join us.
So that does bring us to our next session, but I do want to pause. Do any of you have any kind of hanging questions out there based on everything we went over, what we talked about thus far? Wow, we're just that good, huh? We answered everything you needed to know.
They're dazed.
Any
They're
questions
dazed
on
with
the
it.
web-based live audience?
Can you repeat the information about the conference early bird?
So there is an early bird special, right? So it's $100 off if you register before January 25th, was it? 25th?
Yes.
Yeah. And so it's at safefoodcalifornia.com. So that's $100 in your pocket right there, folks.
Additionally, where do they find local Fresno one-day sessions?
Great question as well. So where can you find the one day? So we have all of our produce safety courses listed on our website, safefoodalliance.com. You go over to events page. Also, if you go to the Produce Safety Alliance website, they have all the courses nationwide, worldwide, I suppose, listed on their website. I'm not sure exactly the route to get there. Of course, you can always do a Google search, Produce Safety Alliance, training, or go to our website and browse through ours as well. So
I believe we have a training coming up in Bakersfield. Might be next week. So check our website. There's also a Spanish training coming up here as well.
Yeah, we have
which
a
will be
number of
held here
courses.
in Kingsburg.
Yeah, we have a number of courses up
Yeah,
and down
check
the
our
state.
website because we're just cranking these things out all the time, and we would love to have you there.
Yeah, and really surprisingly, the Spanish sessions have not been as heavily attended as I would have thought. So I know a lot of operations, you have bilingual folks that maybe would be interested in attending that. Maybe you've attended already, and someone on your team that is in a supervisory role that deals with folks that are primarily Spanish speakers might be someone that would be good to attend one of the Spanish sessions.
If your operation has no employees and we're just performing using contractors for specific activities, if that contractor can affirm compliance and make records available, does that satisfy the requirement?
That's a great question. We get questions. We get questions a lot about using contractors for different services and how that affects your compliance responsibility.
Yes, and this
so-
inquiry, they just said that they basically use contractors for everything.
Right, exactly. And so if you use a contractor for labor, for spraying, for harvesting, which many growers do, the thing is that doesn't absolve you of any responsibility, right? So you've got this product that you're growing and you're selling, right? So ultimately, you have a responsibility in FDA's eyes legally to do everything you can as far as due diligence to make sure it's safe. Now, in terms of contract labor, right, or even spraying or any of these services, really, what does that entail, right? That entails making sure that they understand what the regulation says and that they're complying with it, right? So this is something we'll talk more about later today as well in greater detail. But as a grower, even if all of those services were contracted, I would be making sure that I get some sort of documentation from them saying, yes, I understand this regulation is out. I have been to the one-day training, and I'm making sure that I'm following all the requirements in that regulation.
Because
Right.
some of these things can sneak up on you. The obvious ones would be, labor contractors, people coming out harvesting or pruning. But you have to think about things like contracted spray services. Where'd they get the water to make their mix? Because that's covered under the produce safety rules. So those are some of the things you really have to stop and think about.
Definitely. And a lot of these sprayers, they might, leave your farm with the tank half full. They go get a little more water out of the canal and top up the tank, right? And so they're getting water from a lot of different sources. And that's definitely something that I don't think as an industry we've really fully addressed yet. And there's some other things like that as well.
Mike Villaneva.
That's a very important piece, is when you're using contractors, you gotta know that you're doing the right job. I just say real quick, one of the incidents with one of the outbreaks in Lima was frost, we call that the river peel, and they spray a fungicide. And one of the applicators took water right out of that canal, so it was not appropriate water. And that's one of the suspect causes of some of the contamination. That was E. coli in that water.
Yeah.
So just to repeat that Mike from Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement said that very scenario with the foliar spray water did in fact occur, that water was taken out of a canal by a contractor and used to spray a fungicide onto the romaine lettuce that was then later implicated in an outbreak. So serious stuff.
Definitely.
And then
Annette.
another couple things, so Mike found where the link to the app is. So it's on their website, lgma.ca.gov.
Yeah, so the app is on their website, lgma.ca.gov.
It's under LGMA Tech.
LGMA Tech is what you want to look for on the website. So, you know what we can do too is we can just take that down and we'll send that out after the training as well. So, yes.
And then so for people who are here, we have some postcards with dates of the one-day training.
Yeah, so we do have postcards here for those of you that are present too. They have all the information on some of the one-day trainings that are coming up. We also have some information on the conference as well.
And we'll actually get one of those postcards and read it to you, later in the sessions here. So,
Give
all
that
right.
to you. I think you're about ready to cut over
I
to the
think
water testing.
I am next. If there's no more questions, we're going to talk a little bit about the water issue in a bit more depth, sampling and testing. And I will be joined by my colleague, Pam Cooper, who is our quality manager and somewhat of an expert on water sampling and testing. Come on up, Pam, and why don't you tell the online audience a little bit about you and your qualifications, and who you are, as well as our guests here. Come on up.
Well, I'm Pam Cooper. I'm the Quality Assurance Manager here at Safe Food Alliance over all the labs. There's about four labs in the state of California. And I've been in the quality assurance industry for several years in various aspects, in environmental lab, food labs, production labs. And I've been here going on 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm here to kind of demonstrate how to take a water sample.
Yes, and do it correctly. I can attest as, Pam's supervisor and someone who frequently has to be told, no, that's not within the bounds of the quality system, that she does a very good job at keeping us between the rails, so to speak.
I try.
So with that, we'll get going on water sampling. A little bit about the water quality criteria. Again, these apply directly to covered produce. They may include things like irrigation and foliar sprays, depending on the degree of contact between that covered edible portion of that crop and that water. A little bit about the water quality profile, and we really didn't get into that, but these are kind of the metrics or the numbers that you have to hit on that water. They're looking for something called generic E. coli, which is sort of an indicator organism for the presence of fecal contamination. It's not the bad E. coli, as it were, that makes people ill in the romaine lettuce outbreaks or some of these other issues we talked about. But it's a commonly occurring organism in the intestines of warm-blooded animals and humans. So it's routinely used in water testing as an indicator. So you must have at least less than 126 CFU, or basically counts per 100 milliliters of water. And that should be your average, basically. And you have to have less than 410 CFU, or cells, of E. coli per 100 mils, generic E. coli, for what they call the STV, which is like an error range or a control range. So after we take our samples, we test them, you're going to get this geometric mean, this average, below 126, and we're also going to look at the variability in that data, and it has to meet that less than 410. As part of the regulation, they also added a die-off factor because they did realize that some folks are going to have a hard time hitting those numbers depending on the type of water that they take. Remember that this is a national regulation, so we have fairly clean, good quality irrigation water here, but there's folks in the southeast that have alligators and snapping turtles and things in the water that they're using to irrigate crops. So it can be a challenge sometimes to hit those numbers. They add a die-off factor, or 3.2-fold or half-log die-off factor per day. So in other words, if the number doesn't meet it, and you have enough time between when you apply that water and when you harvest, you can calculate that die-off factor, and if it falls below 126 and 410, you're good to go. Also, on post-harvest water, we talked a little bit about that. There can be no detectable generic E. coli in that water. And if you are using surface water, it must be treated in some fashion. So that's kind of an eye-opener for some folks. I know we did these trainings in the south part of the state. A lot of carrots harvested. They hose the carrots off before they take them in for processing. That's a post-harvest use of the water. They hadn't really thought about that. So that's something to think about as well. These are slides, again, directly stolen from the Produce Safety Alliance training. So whenever you see that little Produce Safety Alliance logo on the bottom of the slide, you know that that's one that we've borrowed from the curriculum. And this just goes quickly through the different types or sources of water that you might use. You might be using a municipal water supply for whatever it is you're doing. If it's a public water source, it's been treated for drinking water. So it has to meet some pretty strict state and federal standards. So you don't really have to do testing on that water. You want to have a copy of the certificate of the quality of that water. So there's no real reason that you have to actually do testing on that. If we're looking at groundwater, the standard is as such: 4 or more times during the growing season over a period of a year, typically that would be a year prior to your compliance date, you would have to pull samples and have them tested for this generic E. coli. You'd calculate your average, you'd calculate your statistical spread, and then every year thereafter, you would take a new sample and test it, recalculate that average, recalculate that statistical spread, and take out the number that was the oldest number. So it's kind of what they call a rolling average. You keep adding new data to it and getting rid of the older data. Below, though, this one statement I think is very telling. Profile samples must be representative of use and must be collected as close in time as practicable to, but before harvest. Translation: they don't want to see you take 4 samples from the wellhead in January when you're not really doing any irrigating, right? They want to see what is the quality of that water when it's likely to be in contact with the produce. So if you're using that for irrigation, if it's in contact with the produce, you basically want to be able to make sure that you are actually using that water and testing it at that time. Surface water, same thing. You've got 20 samples over a period of 2 to 4 years prior to your compliance date that you want to pull. So 10 samples per year, or 5 samples over 4 years if you're going to do a four-year approach to getting that baseline. And the same thing, you roll those 5 samples in, each year you add 5 new samples and you take out the 5 old samples, okay? Same thing, they want to see that that water is being tested and you're doing your profile when that water is being close to being used for harvest. They don't want to see all the samples pulled in an off time when there's no irrigation activity going on or spraying activity. A little bit about those compliance dates, and John mentioned this. Basically, this shows you when your compliance dates are for the water portion of the regulation. So you have until January 26th of 2022 if you're one of the larger operations, 2023 if you're in the $250,000 to $500,000 range, or if you're a very small business until 2024. So that's an extension of an extra couple of years to allow folks to get this water situation under control. But as you see, that's coming up quickly. So that's coming up in 4 years that the water compliance, or 3 years that the water compliance piece for the largest operations has to be in place. So you could actually start collecting water. If you have surface water sources for use on covered produce, you could start collecting those samples now. And in fact, the FDA has basically said, go back, what should growers do in the meantime? And this is really what they should do. They should continue water testing. If they're already doing water testing, to kind of better understand the water quality that they're up against and to meet any requirements if they're in a GAP scheme. But if you've never tested your water, might be a good idea to start now and just try and figure out what is the quality of water that you're using. If you've never done any generic E. coli testing, you want to do that. You want to look at the water before you start using it and during those frequent use periods. Even if you have a little bit of time before you have to actually establish your profile, see if there's any problems now and try to correct those before the regulatory requirements kick into place. A little bit about water sampling, and there's Pam and one of our other colleagues from the micro lab. We're going to talk a little bit about the collection and preservation of water samples for microbiological testing. This is a guidance that we can provide to you. And take it away, Pam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's kind of a simple process. It's just you got to get very careful in sampling the water because we don't want any false positives or, wrong results. We want to get as accurate as possible. And it's basically just a sterile process. It's kind of hard to demonstrate without a hose bib or a water source. But I don't know if we have you can saw us kind of leaning over an irrigation pipe pulling water. This is just a bleach solution. So if you have a hose bib or something like a sprinkler, try to saturate it with bleach and then let it run for about 10 minutes. You can be my assistant.
Yes.
And then we have these little sample containers. They're sterile. So again, basically got to be really careful on keeping it sterile. So there's a little pull tab here and you break the seal. Take the plastic off and don't drop the lid. But don't touch the inside surface. But, keep it away from anything because you can touch your nose or touch your coworker or another surface. It's going to contaminate your sample. And then put your container underneath the water source. And there's a line here that says 100 mils. And that was what your CFU per 100 mils.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to make sure you hit that line. I know it's not hard, people that's watching online. Because if you don't sample that exact amount, because this is, there's a preservative in here that will neutralize the chlorine. And it's measured to the 100 mils. So that's, again, a very critical amount to hit. And then again, don't touch anything and just recap it. And then you have labels, and it's very critical of the time. So on the label, you have a sampling number, a date, a time, the sampling point, the test results, who did the sampling, and then of course your name and address. Write this on here, then put the label on here. The time is critical because there's a specific holding time. It's 8 hours for, is the generic?
Yes, I believe so.
And then if you get it to the lab with in 2 hours, you don't need to keep it on, cool it. Because it should be kept less than 10 degrees if it's going to be longer than that. So again, all these things are critical. They've been tested over time to make sure that you get the most accurate results.
When you say 10 degrees, is that Celsius or
I'm
Fahrenheit?
sorry, Celsius.
Just want to make sure.
Sorry.
No,
I'm so
sorry.
used to that.
What tests should be run on a profile water sample?
It would be generic E. coli. And so in our case, in our laboratory, you actually ask for the water testing for irrigation water, for the produce safety water.
Yeah.
And we know exactly what to run. It's a very specific test. Yes, we have a question here.
I'm not sure, but I know you said you only have to filter out the lesser number as the years go and as you collect, or the flow samples you collect. For E. coli, though, isn't it present and absent? So how would you determine the number or what to filter out?
There are tests that are done that are presence absence, but in this case, they want an actual number, an actual metric. So that's a very good point. You want to make sure that the laboratory you're using for your testing knows to do the testing for this rule. And they even mentioned that they want to have a number. They don't want to have a greater than or a less than, they want some actual number that gives them a metric. Because there's an actual spreadsheet that you plug these numbers into to do all these calculations for you. And we do that for our clients here in the lab. Yes?
It's no difference. It has to be another test if it's before or pre-harvest and different tests during production or post-harvest.
Not necessarily, no. I mean, they really, you asked if there has to be a different test between.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, I am.
Oh, okay,
Um,
sorry.
Yeah, if there's a different test between before versus after.
Correct.
Not necessarily. I mean, it's the same test. The thing you have to understand, though, is if you're using the water for post-harvest, like if you're washing fruit that's been picked or something of this sort, there can be no E. coli in that water. So you would have to establish your water profile and make sure that it is free of any E. coli. And if it's surface water, it would have to have some kind of treatment, some sort of antimicrobial treatment. Yes?
We have specifications for the sampling containers. Will any container labeled sterile be sufficient?
That's an excellent question. The answer would be no.
No, you would need to come by us because we provide them. We provide the containers and the labels for free, and we can ship them to you if you don't want to come by and get them. We can send them out to you.
So I've gone back on the slides, and you say, no, do not take the pill out of the container, do not touch the inside of the lid. There's a little tablet in there, thiosulfite, that's used to preserve that water and neutralize any sanitizer that might be present so that we get a good, accurate reading of the water. So you want to make sure that it's really appropriate for that.
Or a powder.
Yeah,
There's
or a
little
powder.
in here. You can't see
Correct.
it, but there's a powder. Same
Yes, another question.
How many labs are currently available that can accommodate these water tests?
The only lab you really have to be concerned about is our lab. You know, that's also an excellent question. All kidding aside, there has been a delay in part on this rule because of the fact that there weren't too many labs set up for that. So I know that we're set up to do it. That's the main one I'm concerned about, obviously, since I'm the manager of that lab. But you would want to check if you're having water testing done by a water lab. They should know about this. That would be my advice to that individual. Primus does a lot of water testing. They're big in the ag and good ag practices work. Yes, John Kimball.
I just always tell people that if you ask a lab about FSMA testing and they say, about what? You probably shouldn't use them.
Yeah, if they don't know what that is, that's a good sign. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
About that sanitation step. Can you repeat what that
Yeah.
was?
It's a bleach solution.
Yeah.
Work is the easiest.
Does that sanitize like the solution itself?
Yeah, like hose bib, you know, squirt up in there, squirt around it. You can also use a little blowtorch to kind of burn, but that's not, to me, the safest way to do it and most practical.
Right.
So just a bleach solution.
Is there a requirement to let the water run for a certain period?
Yes.
That's also part of the training that we go into in more depth in produce safety rule. And that's right. You want to let that
You
water
flush it.
run. Yeah, yeah. So it's, you know that it's.
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
hard to do without.
And this guidance is a good start. And then once you read that, we can talk to us and we can get you squared away. We also go on farm and we've done some assessments for growers because sometimes they're like, where do I start? You know, we went out and visited one grower and they had water that was coming in from the river. It was up in the Delta, but it went through this elaborate filtration system before it went to their emitters. We go, well, take the sample after the filtration. You know, we don't really care about what it looks like there, but once it goes through that filtration and into your emitters, that's a good spot to take your samples. Yes?
With lab certifications, we use alcohol instead of bleach. Is that okay?
That's okay. It's just bleach is the preferable way. It's just a 10% solution. This is what we use in the lab, so I just happen to bring it in as a kind of a demo.
Can we buy that here?
We don't provide, we haven't.
I don't think we've typically sold it, but I mean, we can certainly
Yeah.
get you the information. And yeah, I mean, we can buy it and you can reimburse us. Certainly, that's an option.
And we're more than happy to show you again how to take the sample
Yeah.
with actual water.
Any other questions on water testing? I know it's kind of a broad area, and so if you think of something and it doesn't quite come to mind now, please reach out to us later. Oh, another one.
Sorry, one more question.
Sure.
We use gloves,
Yes.
and I change the gloves every time. Is that
That's
what
fine,
you're supposed to be doing?
fine. But you gotta
Mm-hmm.
remember, if you have a glove on, yeah, it's sterile, but if you touch your face,
Right.
it's still
That's
gonna.
what, yeah, we change it every time you go away. So, yeah.
Very good. Any other questions? Any questions online? All right.
Great.
Well, thank you. So,
Break.
10-minute break, everybody.
Yay. Thanks, Tom.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and start up again here. So I think they're turning on the microphone for our live audience here. And so I'd like to introduce Mike Villanueva, someone who I would consider a friend, somebody we've known for a number of years now and worked with. I think he knows Tom pretty well.
I do.
And in fact, I remember a few years back before the produce safety rule came out, you came and worked with Tom and you did a one-day training on produce safety at our conference.
That's right. That's right.
So that was kind of my first exposure, and just watching that LGMA video about people getting sick just really brought it home for me. Wow, this is what happens when things go wrong. Yep. So anyhow, I'll just go ahead and kind of let you take the helm here, and we're going to be talking about just some practical strategies dealing with animal control under this rule, and just kind of building further on the one-day training. So
right, when John approached me about animal intrusion, it really hit home, because I think a lot of you know we're going through a pretty rough patch right now, leafy green industry, and it goes back to a big feedlot and contaminated irrigation water and just a whole myriad of things. So it's kind of become personal for me, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more, maybe beyond what the basic produce safety rule talks about, because it's a little thin in my regard. It certainly covers key points, but I thought this would be a good opportunity to maybe ramp things up a little bit and give you some ideas of what we look for when we're doing our assessments, risk assessments on animal activity, animal intrusion, and some of the things we're doing at the LGMA. Not to say you need to do those, but I thought it would be good to sort of talk about it from that standpoint. So sure. Which one of these?
Just the forward one right there. Yeah, the arrow to the right. Yeah, that one.
Okay.
There you go.
So let's see here. That's not one I wanted to cover. Okay. So what we kind of wanted to talk about today here was in the 30 minutes I got, and I'll go through these fairly quickly because I don't want you guys getting farther time, but I want to talk about factors that are associated with animal intrusion, animal activity, and how to assign risks. With the LGMA, we have low risks and high risk, and those have different action points for the grower who is ever doing those assessments. And one of the things I found with us is by doing that and defining your own risk levels, it's a lot easier to do risk assessments. We really struggled early on with some of these activities where go out and do a risk assessment, John, and then people say, well, what's that? So we've been able to sort of put in some break-off points. Oh, okay.
He flipped his computer around for you.
I can't hardly see that, though. And one of the things I'll touch upon today, too, is SOPs, standard operating procedures, and they're the backbone of the LGMA food safety program. And I would encourage you to think about writing SOPs, because it gives you an opportunity to define activities done on the same way every time. It's a great training tool as well. So we really rely heavily. And actually, the rule does allude to the importance of SOPs. So one of the things we have as far as animal activity is we don't really designate animals. Our sense is if you got animals in the field, and that's birds, that's raccoons, that's just about it. If they crap in the field, you probably got contamination. So rather than focus on just a few select animals, we consider any kind of an animal as a potential risk, and don't make that designation. And I think that's really, really important, because you get bogged down on the details. So we want to make sure that that's a good takeaway here. And certainly the rule doesn't talk about that, nor does USDA's GAP programs, and no GAP programs really make animal distinctions. We used to do that. So one definition of an animal hazard is pretty straightforward, but it really defines all the things you need to be looking for when you're doing a risk assessment: feathers, skin, any opportunity animal presence in the field. And it gives a reasonable person the idea that we've got some activity in the field. So it's not just tracks. It's other indications that an animal has been in and around your produce field. So in 06, when we had the big spinach outbreak, we focused on 015787, and that was the pathogen we were concerned about. We weren't worried about salmonella. We weren't worried about some of the other ones. But now, that list has grown significantly, and it's really raised the burden as far as growers. In addition to 0157, we've got several, we call them S-Techs. It's considered the big seven. We're already seeing requirements that we got to test for all of these pathogens. Now we have listeria. Certainly salmonella has become a big issue. They even got cyclospora. You were talking about parasites earlier. For the first time, I think a couple of months back, cyclospora showed up. So the list of things we need to be worried about continues to grow. And that pretty much is all related to animals and animal activity.
Mike, interestingly, with cyclospora too, I think on some of these things, there's evolving ability to test for them.
Exactly.
Where
right.
maybe 10 years ago, we didn't really have the technology to test as well as we can today.
That's genome sequencing is really changed the landscape. FDA and the regulatory agencies can really drill down very quickly. So it's changed quite a bit for sure. And I mentioned earlier, animals a significant risk, and this is what we're concerned about now. That's the different animals that we've seen associated with animal activity in fields. So that's why it's almost impossible to designate certain animals. We just wanted to put that up for an example. Keep it simple, keep it manageable. So, pathogens from animals, there's a variety of things. We just oftentimes think about feces, but as you can see from that list, fur, feathers, anything of hooves, tracks in the field. And I think you mentioned earlier, John, if you've got contamination on a road or different spots, animals come through there, they can pick up those contamination sources into the field they go. So a lot of different things to consider when you think about animal intrusion and animal contamination from animals. So some things that I think that are important to think about in terms of how your fields and your crops can become exposed. Species, the location of that field, that becomes very, very critical when you're doing a risk assessment. And I certainly drives home with what we're up against right now with that big feedlot down in Yuma and growing conditions right downhill from that. And I think that slide you put up earlier really hit that. Seasonal considerations, we know that there's certain times of the year when animals shed more. That's something that needs to go into your risk assessment as well. And as you work in this environment more, this becomes much more common knowledge, at least from our standpoint. So considerations, I think these are really important because when you look at conditions and activities in the field, it's not just one animal or two. And I think this list really talks about how you can begin analyzing and defining and putting a risk factor into place. Volume and concentration of the animals. How often do you see them? Do you only see them once in a while? Do you see them a lot? All that's going to certainly have an impact on that risk assessment you do. Aggregate. One of the things we fight in Salinas is Canadian geese, and they are very great aggregators. And if they get into your field, you got big problems. And then just being over a flyway, for example. Seasonal migrations. Certainly when we think about birds and migrations, there's certain times of the year when that becomes a bigger issue. And just the ability to transfer pathogens. Animals are different. So that's why we keep it generic, and then you factor in all those things. You're going to be able to do a pretty good risk assessment, I think. So want to talk a little bit about just doing a risk assessment. Who actually, does what you consider an actual risk assessment on a day? Okay. How do you do it? What do you consider?
Well, we're two fruit growers, so
Okay.
it just depends on the adjacent land. If there's a dairy next to us, even if fruit grows right there, what's around us, coyotes, that's inevitable.
Sure.
What kind of we're putting or none. If there's any things like that.
Right.
All those things, biological chemicals.
There's a myriad. You hit a key. Adjacent land use obviously is we've had a couple of cases where somebody across the way wasn't growing leafy greens, but they're going to apply compost. They just dropped it down. The wind kicked up 40 miles an hour, boom, into the field. So being cognizant of those things is very important. One of the things we do at the LGMA, and I think it's important consideration for you in terms of animals, going back to all those points brought up earlier with concentration, frequency of sighting, the type of animals, is to do a walk around before you harvest. That's a requirement of the LGMA, is before you take the machine into the field, you walk the perimeter, you look for indications of animal activity. And if you do have a problem, then that's the opportunity to go in and take some corrective actions. You buffer, you don't harvest it, which gets back to your, I think your point earlier, John, about training and how important it is that not only the sort of the crew boss, but the folks that are actually in the field doing the cutting, training them to be able to recognize a problem and then report it. They become, you know, just that additional sets of eyes and ears. Low risk and high risk. And I touched upon those earlier. And not to say that that might work for everybody in this room, but certainly there's different levels of risk. And for us, a low risk means less things we have to do. It can be handled with the company's own SOP, and we'll have some examples, some slides. But if it's a higher risk, then there's certain steps you have to follow per the LGMA. But I like the distinction because you can really get bogged down in small potential contamination sources versus a major event where you've got to walk, you've got to totally analyze, you've got to get your handle around what the scope and scale of that contamination is. So just a suggestion, it works well for us. And again, I think it's helped define how you do a risk assessment, because it brings that either the crew foreman or the food safety for that particular company involved in making those decisions. So we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by that. Tracks in the field, low risk, high risk. Tree fruit, low risk, high risk. Could be, right. And so you see something like that, there's a lot of things that could happen. Well, maybe it just coyotes are a good example. When they go, a lot of times they just go right to the road. They want to go to something else. But you got to determine that they didn't, veer off course and potentially contaminate. Mm-hmm. That's where you get into those distinctions. But if you don't look and investigate, then you're not going to have a good sense of what that, because, basically if he just went right through and didn't contaminate anything, you're probably going to be all right. But until you can make that distinction between the low and high risk, you're just not sure of what you got.
Mike, would you say when you saw the tracks is important too? Because I would say January and the day before harvest are probably two different scenarios, aren't they?
They are exactly. In fact, we do two risks. We'll do one 7 days out before that field is going to be harvested, and then one on the day of harvest, because things can change. The adjacent land use can change overnight. Everything might look.
There's more people in the field, then obviously they have to be there. But in the winter, nobody's there. That's where they're at.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. So that's a good point, John. Yeah, and then you start looking for just generic activity. This was deer tracks about 50 feet from a field. That's as far as they went. That's something you would document. It's certainly a low risk because there doesn't appear to be any contamination. But anytime you have animal activity or evidence of intrusion, you should document it. You want to have a track record, and having gone through multiple outbreaks, FDA, the more you can demonstrate and justify that you've done the right thing, the better it is. And so you mentioned, I think, John, that keeping those records even past 2 years, because FDA can kind of just come in and start drilling down real quick. And when you talk about records, one thing we've been asked to provide is audit results to the regulatory agency they want to see. So this kind of gets beyond just what we're talking about here today.
I think the records of animal activity is something that's going to be very, very new for a lot of folks in commodities that maybe I would personally consider lower risk. Tree crop, things like that.
Right.
And I think that's one of the questions that comes up a lot is what level of records do I need to keep, right? And
well, that's why a low and high risk distinction is important. If it's a low risk, basically, we saw some tracks and it wasn't in the field, boom, you're done with that. But if you continue to have problems, that could elevate into something more significant. Then you've got a paper trail.
Yeah.
And that's really important, I think, for sure.
And on the other side, if FDA shows up and asks you for your records and you say, well, I didn't see any animal activity, I don't keep any records of it, there's nothing. That's going to be hard to believe too, right? So it seems like somewhere in the middle ground where you've at least got some sort of record showing that your due diligence and that you're on top of things
Right.
is always important.
And we always hear, more records. But if you get into a situation, they can really, really help. So thank you. So, some of the things we see in the fields, animals chewing on the fields, I just want to point out, this is one technique that works for the leafy greens industry, is if you've got some activity chewing, it's primarily right in the first 5 to 10 feet of the field. A good activity is just let them have it. Let them have that part and buffer it off. Generally, they won't go in any farther. Rather than try to eradicate the animals, you sort of meet them halfway, and that's been a pretty good practice for us. Maybe not so much in your industry, but these animals do a lot of the same things over and over again. So getting to know that is important. Low risks. These are just some things we see with birds. Birds are probably our most challenging deal, and I think even in tree fruit and different ones, bird activity on crop. But how significant is it? How prevalent is it? So you need to look. One of the things we see with birds is generally they fly over, they land. You got to go investigate and make sure there hasn't been something that resulted from that activity. But generally those are low risks because you're not going to keep birds out, and you can't waste your time going constantly. Canadian geese, different ball game. But just the occasional sparrow flying over. If they're in your field, like I think we got a slide of one like that, is one that causes, when you get a regulatory person out and they see that, they go, uh-oh, contamination. Well, no, we went out, it flew away, there was no problems, we're good to go. But you'd maybe alert the crew that there have been some bird activities, and that's where the training with the PSR comes into play. And this is sort of an example of what we see occasionally with birds in the field. Some droppings. It's very isolated. That would be for us a low risk. We're not going to we'll probably harvest that and cut it out and take it out of the field, but we're not going to spend a lot of time buffering and flagging and things like that. So that's where the training for your crew becomes very, very important. So we do have high risks, and then it takes on a whole nother level of activity. And there's a lot of things that go into that, but essentially it's big enough that you're going to have to take actions. For us, it's buffering, it's flagging off, it's making sure that people don't get in there and cross-contaminate product from another angle. I think a lot of your crops are probably less affected by that, but I think there's times when you're going to probably have a high risk with animal activity, even in tree fruit. So it just depends on the circumstances, but I think it's an important distinction to make. So it's just some other slides of what we see on occasion with activity. This was one that we spotted. We don't know what it was, but actually there was a lot of that, and they ended up flagging off, I think, about 5 acres, and just had to take the disc to it. But yeah,
circles.
yeah, there you go. Some other examples of that. But when you see that then probably harvest is delayed, because you're going to have to walk all of those rows and see what the scope scale of that intrusion is. So it becomes not only possibly losing the crop, but the crew's not working. It takes on some pretty significant economic impacts. And here's another example of just animals walking down the field. Here's one where I think it was a coyote. We didn't have to do a whole lot with that one, but again, making that distinction between a high and low risk. When you got wet rows, you can really see those tracks, and any activities stands out very, very nicely. We see pellets up on the field, on the banks. Generally, we consider that's probably a potential contamination. And then that investigation begins as far as how significant has that exposure, that intrusion been. Another one of our activities there. So there's certain areas for us, and I bet it is in your industry, where you just have more issues with animals in terms of activities. And you can see that oftentimes in just the surrounding areas. Waterways and things like that. So I'm gonna keep you guys on time. Wanted to show you this slide. It doesn't come out as well as I would like it, but this actually happened. The Food and Drug Branch was investigating an outbreak down in El Centro. They were driving back, and that's about 1,000 seagulls in a field that's being harvested. That's the machine behind there.
Wow.
This Food and Drug
Didn't
stopped.
even scare them away, huh?
Food and Drug stopped. They got out. They went and interviewed the crew foreman, and he said, "Well, birds aren't significant risks, so we don't worry about them." We had to do a lot of fast talking on that one, but it happens. Major event, and so that's one of the reasons we changed to get away from animals, any animal, regardless. And obviously that harvest came to a screeching halt. Ironically, there's a huge composting operation about a mile away from this, and it's just loaded with gulls.
Yeah. That's where they came from.
That's where they came from. Just some examples of what we consider low risk when you just occasionally see an animal, that lone coyote, that bird flying over, like we showed earlier. All these things have to be investigated, though. What about this one? Busy, right? Busy.
Yeah, that's crazy.
We didn't stage that happens. Some high hazard examples, and we have issues with pigs, and feral pigs can be a real challenge. But you just see it; it's very prevalent. There's a lot of activity, and we've had fields just totally destroyed with feral pigs. I mean, they just come in. Oftentimes, they're just going through. They like grapes, so they go through a lettuce field to get up the field. But essentially, you've got to investigate and determine the scope and scale of that. These are some of the things I talked about earlier, but things like CAFO. I think someone mentioned earlier the lagoon water can be a very, very big challenge, and that's what we're battling down in the desert right now is feedlots. There's about 20 in El Centro or Imperial County, and that's a problem. And because of that, we've had to change our buffer from 400 feet to a mile.
Wow.
on a large feedlot. They just have to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that has a potential effect in just about any commodity that grows. Just some other sort of general examples of things to look for that may suggest a high risk. And yeah, I'm not going to read those. You can see them, but it's generally just a visual observation, making that assessment, and then going accordingly. One of the things we have, and I was going to make this available. It's a decision tree.
Okay.
We're big on decision trees. We do it for water. We do it for animal intrusion, and people really find that reassuring because they can do things and they know exactly where to go. I'll give you a copy of it if you think it might have some value.
Absolutely.
Because it's all animal based, right? So livestock, just real quick, I'm going to zip through these things we worry about with domestic livestock. Primarily, it's runoff, hills running down on the crop. But I think that bottom slide picture is very telling. You got birds working around an animal feeding operation, a CAFO. Those birds are going to go somewhere. They're probably going to go to your tree fruit field, and then you got a problem, right? Because I can guarantee you there's going to be cross-contamination that's probably going to happen there.
Mm-hmm.
Another example I think encompasses a lot. Small feeding operation, you got a water source, it's downhill, you've got leafy greens, you could have any kind of a commodity growing, so it's that visual assessment. Issues with deer, we got real problems with them in different locations, and again, they forage, they come into your crop. Oftentimes they can be fairly significant in numbers, and then they come and go. So there's different ways to manage that, but they can be a big problem. Feral pigs, bad business. I'll just leave it at that. They can absolutely destroy a field. And the wild birds, I think our big issue there is when they aggregate, a lot of them land in a field, and essentially you're going to lose some significant acreage there. Do they land much in like tree fruit and trees and things like that? I don't know much about your commodities, but.
No, we just have bird tags on the roof, that's about it.
Okay.
And when they pick, if there's any contamination, like bird food, it doesn't
Just done. Yeah. Yep. Good. Okay. Small carnivores. We talked about coyotes earlier, raccoons. They can all be a nuisance in your fields. That's for sure. So it's stray dogs. I think we all battle with that. A lot of our fields, and I'm sure a lot of your crops, John, are close to houses.
Yeah.
How do you manage that? They get out, they get in your fields. So we see a lot of that for sure. And rodents and rabbits. Been a lot of work done through Center for Produce Safety and others that have sort of established the range of some of these small animals. And it's not too far. They generally just stay right on the edges of the field. And so that's a good thing. But you never see them. They all work at night. So that's where that pre-harvest assessment becomes so critical. We even worry about reptiles and amphibians. All of these animals have all demonstrated that they carry pathogens, human pathogens. So that's why we worry about them to some degree. Real quick, I'm almost done. Yeah, but there's some other things to worry about as well beyond just the animal intrusion that is a secondary result, cross-contamination. Fecal matter that gets in the field, irrigation. We still do a fair amount of overhead irrigation, more to bring crops up, but it's still done in some occasions. So if there's feces in the field, we found that through research that the water hitting that can actually then spread the feces onto a crop. Again, maybe you're not even going to be able to see that. So your irrigation practices, production practices can have a potential risk that you need to be aware of. So that's why it's important to look at your fields before you do certain things. And we know that the climate, the time of season, we know that 0157 animals shed more in the summer. That's why a lot of our outbreaks show up in late summer, early fall. That's been proven through again research. So if feedlots provide opportunities for dust control, if it's not managed properly, you've got potential fecal matter in the air, aerosolized, and then goes out into the field. So we worry about that, and then the birds flying over and carrying that to other parts of the state. It becomes a risk management, and one of the things, and I'm sure some of you folks have encountered that, where you want to make your fields as safe as they can, but then suddenly you got fish and game knocking on your door because you took out some controls, if you will. So there's another regulatory side of managing risk, and you got to make sure that you're not violating other rules and regulations. The rule is very specific on that, the produce rule, that it's co-inhabitation, and we do a lot of work with the different state and federal agencies on that. And I'm sure that depending on circumstances you might encounter, you could encounter that. So it's good to know that the regulations are very specific, that we got to work side by side. So I went through that fairly quickly because John was long this morning.
It's all my fault.
No. Any questions?
Are you okay with us posting these slides for the online audience afterwards?
Pardon?
Are you okay if we post these slides for the online audience afterwards?
You can do that.
Excellent. So Mike, thanks so much for your time on this. And I think there may be some folks that are just getting started with this and haven't really done much and don't know where to start. Would you say that really risk assessment is kind of the first step, right? Because relative to the crop, relative to the timing of harvest and what activity they have in their field, that's kind of the starting point, isn't it? And then from there you determine what to.
Right. You need to know what you have, what circumstances. I know Jason Land. One thing I would recommend is do a pre-season analysis of your growing operations. See what you got in terms of water, feedlots perhaps, or CAFOs. Any of those things that have a potential impact can be problematic for sure. Great. All right.
Yeah. So the next section we're going to jump into just a discussion around it was an employee hygiene, right? What was the next subject? Yes. And so, Mike, you're welcome to stay if you want to comment on any of this. I know with LGMA, there's some robust controls around that as
I
well.
might, there's a couple of things I might chime
Yeah,
in
so
on.
just
And
feel free to stay here up front if you want, and then, or, you know, whatever makes you
I
comfortable.
better go to the back. I don't want to steal your thunder.
Yeah, you'll stir up things, won't you?
I don't want to steal you.
You'll stir things up. No. And you can join me if you want, Tom. Yeah, whatever you want. I will say too, as we dive into this and the following subject, we will be taking lunch from 12 to 1, and then at 1 o'clock we're talking about produce safety from the processor's perspective, which some of you may find interesting, because I know some processors are asking, okay, what do I do about produce safety? How do I qualify my suppliers, my growers that I'm buying from? I think that's a useful subject for them, and for some of you folks who are here, you may want to be interested. You may be interested in that subject as well. So, did I say something that wasn't?
I think it was not very harsh.
Okay, well, that's fine.
So,
Yes.
might get cozy.
So let's go ahead and
We
dive
have
into
more
this
chairs, so
topic.
it's okay.
Good, perfect.
Yeah.
Great. So employee hygiene and managing labor contractors. You know, this is something that kind of dovetails out of that previous question, right? I have contractors I use for harvest, for spraying, whatever. And I think it's important to understand, what does the rule actually say in detail about, you know, what rules I should have in place for my employees, and how do I broach that with contract labor if I'm not the one overseeing them and I've hired them? And we'll kind of talk about that toward the end of the section. So in general, when we talk about employees and folks that are coming into contact with our products, right, that's an important subject. There are some what we refer to in the processor realm as GMPs, good manufacturing practices, related to personnel. There are good agricultural practices that are kind of equivalent under the regulation. They're a little bit more, I guess, minimal. They're not as detailed as what we would expect for a processor facility. But they are there, and there's some fundamental important things like we've already alluded to with hand washing and things like that. And so we're just going to kind of build out on that a little bit here, right? So training and qualification is the important first piece to that. And really the employees that we have in place out there, whether they're ours, whether they're contracted, there should at minimum be a general food safety training that occurs every year. It's a recurring training every year. Best timing, I would say, is probably you know, right before they start working each year, since it's usually seasonal, right? So before we start the harvest activities, let's get them in and get them trained and remind them about visitor controls, the importance of hand washing, cleanliness around our clothing and our shoes and what we do before we come to work. Recognizing illness is another required element of that, right? Whether it's themselves or somebody else, these are the symptoms you should be looking for. If you are throwing up, you shouldn't be working. Things like that. They're really the fundamental stuff that we have to reiterate, because sometimes people don't know it, or they choose to ignore it if we don't bring it up and discuss it with them. So in addition to that, all employees should be qualified for their task, which really kind of implies a process that we have in place for qualifying, for training employees, meaning, yes, everybody gets this general food safety training. Wash your hands, right? If you eat, wash your hands after that. If your clothes are dirty, right? All these things, it's a general train, but then if I'm running a machine, or if I'm hand harvesting, or if I'm doing some specific task, there should be a training related to that task as well that's more detailed on how do I train these folks? How do I make sure that they're, you know, that they're qualified for that task? Doesn't mean that everybody has to sit through a long PowerPoint session and they have to sign a sign-in sheet and answer a bunch of questions on a quiz, right? A lot of times training is not in a classroom, is it? Right? A lot of times training is on the job. But how do we qualify them? Maybe we do a quick training verbally, and then we go watch them do the task, and we sign them off that, okay, I've watched them do it. They're qualified. They know what to do. Maybe they made a mistake, and I pointed it out, and now they're going to avoid it next time. Right? Because you all know, we all know that you sit somebody in a classroom for an hour, and you know, half of what you say probably just goes out the other ear. Right? I mean, after a while, the brain can only follow so much, and so we've got to make sure that in practice, they're doing the right things. So there is the official one-day training. We've already talked about this a bit. today, and the one-day training is approved by FDA. We are one of the many organizations that are offering this training. And really the focus is, as it says on your slide there, at least one supervisor or other individual involved in the daily operations has to have attended this training, right? So we're looking for a point person, a key person that's involved in the operation to make sure that we're enforcing the expectations and making sure that it's not something that one person can do really, right? It's one person who gets trained and then passes that on to everybody else. So we're making sure that everybody comprehends, everybody is qualified, and that person is the starting point for that process. So now we get into what do we do around harvest, right? Employees that are conducting harvesting activities that are coming into contact with produce. In some cases, for some of you in the room, maybe they're not hand harvesting these products. Maybe it's a machine harvesting activity. And so those are two different things. It may look different there. But the same overarching principles still apply in terms of protecting the products from contamination. And so you've got to take the regulatory expectations and say, okay, how do I tailor that to what I do? Right? So employees should recognize any produce that may be contaminated and shouldn't be harvested. Right? So as Tom said, don't pick poop. Right? That's a great phrase to train your folks. Right? Some of the photos that Mike showed with evidence right on the products, we obviously don't want to be putting that into the food chain. So another piece to this around harvest is inspecting harvest containers or equipment, right? So equipment is something that's shaking the tree, right? Or carrying the produce. Containers we're putting it in. Is it clean? Is it maintained, right? If it's not maintained, I mean, we've got a wooden bin that's got metal and wooden fragments getting into products. Plastic bin that's breaking and we got foreign material in there. But even more so, I've heard stories of bins with animal feces, bird droppings in them, and they say, oh, go ahead and use it. And that's not something we want to hear, is it?
Or nuts, for example. You might have an animal dropped nuts in there. That's an allergen.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is true. And that's another risk. And it's something we don't think about on the farm as much, right? But some of these pieces of equipment that are used for harvest, some of these truck trailers, they're going to have other nuts than what you grow, right? And an almond and a walnut are not the same thing. You might think, oh, well, they're both tree nuts, so it's okay. But no. Some individuals are allergic to one or the other, but not both, right? So, and some of the same trailers that are used for nuts are used for wheat. And there are a lot of individuals that have an allergy to wheat, that have celiac disease and things like this. So we've got to really be thinking about allergens too, and that's a good point.
Right.
So then also we've got to make sure that, that they're clean, that they're maintained, that we're correcting any problems with this equipment, with these containers prior to using them if it's going to be a risk. We talked about bacteria, we talked about allergens, but if you've got hydraulic fluid, if you've got oil leaking, getting into the produce potentially, gosh, that's a risk too. And I'll tell you right now, and I don't know how many of you actually use food grade lubricants, but anything that's potentially going to come in contact with produce, you should be opting for a food grade version of any lubricants wherever possible. I know food grade greases are readily available for bearings and things like that. If you've got an oil filled gearbox or something like that, those you should be trying to opt for a food grade version of the oil that you put into that wherever possible, or purchase one that already has food grade wherever possible. Food grade doesn't mean no risk. You're not going to spread food grade grease onto your sandwich for lunch, right? We always say that in training. It's still, there's still a risk there if you're consuming large amounts of it, but it's approved for what we say incidental contact, accidental little bit of contact with the products. So illness or injury, and we've got the image there from the produce safety training that I stole of somebody out in the field who's obviously showing a sign of illness. If somebody's running to the restroom every 15 minutes or exhibits some other sign of illness, we definitely should have an eye on that, right? We need to take action. Don't turn a blind eye. Say, well, I don't want to get in trouble. Maybe they'll call a lawyer or something and get mad at me and try to sue me or something because I told them to go home. But you know what? This is law, right? Federal law that we protect the food supply so people don't get sick. So you are within your rights to protect your product from contamination. So also cuts, lesions, any other injuries. we know that when we get an infection, pathogens can be there, right? Staph aureus can be there. Other organisms can be there. And anything we carry in our own blood, which people do carry pathogens in their blood sometimes, and that's all something that could be a risk of contaminating those food products. So again, if they have specific symptoms, they cannot work, and supervisors should be instructed to make sure that people that are ill don't work. People should be trained to tell their supervisors that they're ill. All right, so general cleanliness, of course, is important. And you got to make sure that whether it's your clothing, your shoes, your hands, there's a risk of break food, allergens. There's a risk of, working on your transmission at home and then coming in with grease that gets on the food. But the biggest risk by far, I would say, is pathogens, and making sure that they're not on our clothes, on our hands when we're coming into contact with produce. But even if it's not directly with produce, am I touching product contact surface? Oh, I just work on the equipment. I don't handle the produce, but I have to go out there and fix it because they had to shut it down. It stopped working right. So I go out there and I fix that conveyor belt. I got my hands on it. Okay, let's start up again. Produce is going on that belt again now. Well, I just touched it, didn't I?
Or harvest knives or anything like that.
Yeah, anything like that. Definitely. So again, hand washing, the basics, before work, after break, anytime you touch an animal or anytime their hands may become contaminated. So hand washing, I will say, you see the image there on the slide. It is always great to use a visual reminder, visual cues. I know Mike's organization probably has a lot of these different tools that you can use available. There's a lot of these that you can get from local health departments or on the web. Post something to remind people visually, keeping in mind a lot of our crews may not be very able to read well. Right? Some of our folks may not be able to read very well, if at all. And so pictures are great. Pictures are great reminders, right? So soap, running water, and adequate drying. We already kind of got into that earlier today. I don't know. Feel free to stop me if you have any questions, but I think I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide since we kind of already talked about that one. And then if used, if people are wearing gloves, they should be in good condition. They should be kept clean. Again, they're a source of contamination potentially. What's the risk if a glove is not kept in good condition? I'm handling products and the glove is starting to tear. What's the risk? Cross-contamination, yeah. From, believe it or not, from your hands. Your hands go in the glove, they get all sweaty in there, and then you rip it and boom, contamination from your hands. Mike?
Yes, Mike.
So that's why it's important that you wash your hands.
That reduces risk, yes.
That's right, because it will reduce the population, but then eventually, as those hands sweat, it starts to grow back.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say, why do I wash my hands?
Right.
Yeah. And this has been a subject of discussion for many years in the food industry too, is glove use, because people somehow have this concept that their hands are magically sterile because they have gloves on.
Magic
right?
gloves, that's
I'm
right.
picking up a shovel, I'm touching the handrails, but my hands are still sterile, right? I even heard a story, somebody told me they were auditing and they watched somebody as they went, oh, these gloves are kind of, they don't look great. I'm going to turn them inside out and put them back on. Okay. So I would say there's a training opportunity there, to say the least, don't you think? Right?
Yeah, they probably think the glove is there to keep their hands clean. It's like, no, the glove is there to protect the food from what's on your hands. So,
right.
Right.
So when in doubt, replace the glove.
Right.
So, yeah. Animals, right? Again, animals are a big risk. They're carriers of pathogens and things. So we want to avoid contact with animals, or where we are in contact with a working animal, or we've got a dog in the truck. If we're going to be handling the produce or product contact areas or out there in the field, we've got to make sure that we're not ourselves becoming a risk to the products, whatever that means, whether that means a change of shoes, whether that means washing hands, or staying out of the field, right? Just whatever's appropriate in terms of measures for your situation. So jewelry, I put on there on the slide that it is best, in my mind, to prohibit jewelry when people are directly handling produce. We've got things like necklaces, earrings, hair clips and things. Definitely we need to be avoiding those things because they can fall into the produce. When you get into specifics about what the rule itself requires, it specifically does say if you're wearing hand jewelry and you're handling produce, that you shouldn't wear that jewelry if it's difficult to clean. So I would say that's a very, very low standard for jewelry. I would say go above that, right? So Mike, you have a comment on that?
Well, what we allow is clean baby.
Yes.
All good.
Yeah, and that's kind of the standard, isn't it? Right? A plain band with no stones.
Yeah, so what Mike said is LGMA allows a single smooth band, no jewelries or anything like, or no, stones or anything like that in the jewelry. Something smooth that's easy to keep clean.
Right, definitely. So, and as you can see on the slide there, I don't know, maybe you can't see it that well, but the fingernails are actually decked out with some jewels as well. So there's an additional risk there. So maybe that person should just put gloves on if they're going to be handling products. But we always encourage employees not to have any kind of decorations, false fingernails, things like that, because that becomes a risk factor. So, and that's just one of many examples where we see that this regulation may set a very minimal standard, a very kind of low standard, but it's up to us based on our products and our operation to assess and determine where we need to elevate that standard above the minimal regulatory requirement, because it does become a risk, even if we follow the minimal requirement, which you kind of alluded to with the animal controls and things that you talked about already, that the minimal regulatory requirement in many cases is not enough. And we see that on the operational side as well for processors, right? That we have these minimum GMPs, and even under FSMA now we have more requirements for preventive controls, but customers are still asking for a higher standard yet, right? Which is what we see in the produce industry as well. Customers are starting to ask for, well, very minimal to meet the produce safety rule, but I'm asking you to also do this, right? So be ready. You're going to start getting those questions more and more.
And John, I think this is a good time to plug for SOPs. Write all of these policies down.
Yes.
Your policy is for jewelry, any other blade, your policies for gloves. Once you write all those down, then that's your program. And you can train it.
Yeah, definitely. I know, I think they said that we could hear Mike fairly well with the online audience, but just to reiterate, he kind of said that this is a good time to put in a plug for SOPs and make sure we have all those policies documented, right? And the thing is, you kind of connect between, okay, our documented policy, okay, we take that policy now, we train people to be qualified for their position, right? And so what you do in that policy should be keeping it up to date and using it as a tool, right? I encourage you, if you're gonna have a policy, don't just do it to have a policy that's written down, use it as a tool to make your program more effective. So we touched on this a little bit, but we'll just kind of reiterate and build upon it a little bit. When we're dealing with a labor contractor, who is responsible, right? In my mind, there's a shared responsibility really between the grower and the labor contractor and their crew. Because again, the grower, as a grower, you own the product and you're selling it to XYZ customer, and that customer is trusting you to provide them a certain level of integrity within that product, that it's going to be safe. And so, the fact that we have a contractor coming in to do that doesn't mean that you can turn a blind eye, obviously. And I know you don't want to, right? I'm not saying you want to either as a grower. And you're trying to just determine, well, where is your responsibility level there? But the produce owner really, in my mind, is responsible ultimately to make sure the integrity is maintained on that produce. And the labor contractor is responsible for enforcing the law with their employees and understanding what the law is, right? And so then those supervisors also that are overseeing that crew should be trained to the produce safety rule, right? The one-day training, they should have attended that in my mind. And so as a grower then, what's that?
Yep.
Yeah, so you require that contractors comply with the rule and go to that course. And I think that's legally what should happen.
Yeah, that's right up front in your contract.
Yeah, exactly. So make sure that that's in your contract, in your agreement. Make sure you're talking to these contractors about this, right? There should be documentation you have on hand, because then if they go, while you're not looking, they go out there and they're not following the law, there's contamination,
right?
And it's on them. Well, you've done what you can. You've done your due diligence, right? Where you've got documentation in place. They've agreed with you to follow the rule, but they didn't, right? So then in my view, now I'm not a lawyer, right? But in my view, then you've done your due diligence, and that becomes something that can be tracked back to them. But ultimately, you've got to keep in mind your name's on the paperwork, your name's on the box as it goes out, right? Or you know, so it can impact your business even when it's not your fault. And I know people that have lost money on issues from their suppliers. Peanut Corporation of America, there was so much money, so many people hurt, just a terrible scenario all around. And a lot of those folks that were impacted downstream had no idea that the products were contaminated.
Right.
And, you know, they tried to do what they could, but they lost a lot of money on that. They had customers of theirs that were hurt, which is even worse than the money being lost. And ultimately, reputation damage is something you want to avoid.
And bankruptcy.
And of course, bankruptcy, right? So yeah, definitely. And so a little due diligence in the short run is always best, right? So prevention, right? They say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Pound of cure.
So,
That's right.
So what to do today on this when it comes to labor contractors? Don't assume, right? Don't wait to do something. Make sure your agreements with these folks are clear, and make sure that with training records, the crews that are out in your fields, right? Get a copy of those training records, or at least at a minimum, make sure that that company is going to be Johnny on the spot if you need records. Because when FDA contacts you, when they show up, or of course in California, the state shows up to enforce and they start asking you about records, you should be able to produce those things, right? You should be able, if you don't have them already on hand, call the company up and they should be Johnny on the spot to get them to you. But the easiest thing is to say, okay, after you train your crew, just send me those records. Send me a scan on my email, or drop off a file folder with those so I have them just in case I need them. Just in case. All right, so I think we're a little bit within our window on this one. Any questions? Any follow-up questions or anything on this subject?
Do contractors who do work such as collecting to train records as well for their employees?
Yeah, so do contractors that do things such as collecting samples out in the field and things like that need to keep training records? Well, I would say yes, right? Because under the regulation, we as growers are responsible for making sure any visitors understand our rules and comply with them. And the best way to do that is either to train those folks ourselves or make sure they have an adequate training program in place. And then we should be able to confirm and do spot checks on what they're doing out there in our fields. Because again, it's our field, isn't it? It's our product.
For example, I know like in water sampling, you know, we had Pam come up here and talk. She definitely has all the training records for everyone that's been trained to go out and do that sampling. And she can provide that information to the person.
Mm-hmm. That's part of our ISO certification for the lab here.
That's correct.
The lab is held to a very high standard in terms of training, in terms of making sure we have consistent results and all of that. So, okay.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Comment. So FLCs are also considered a farm, and under the definition they have to comply
Yes.
with the rules. So it's their responsibility because they're doing a harvesting activity that there considers them a farm, therefore they are responsible for all of the
Yeah.
rules. So if you are contracting any FLC, you need to make sure that they are in compliance. If they're in compliance, you can provide you that documentation or whatever your agreement
Right.
is. Then you're ensuring that they are also meeting the requirements. So when they're on your property, they're meeting.
Yeah, thank you for making that point. And I should have put that in the slides, but you're absolutely right. A farm labor contractor is under the definition